Hello, and welcome to part 2 of the How to Play Chess playlist. Part 1 covered how the pieces move and how they capture one another, so be sure to check that out if you need a refresher on that. If you're all good with that, then you might be wondering, how do I win the game? What am I actually trying to do? Well, that's what we're covering in this video, along with a few other things I left out of part 1, just because they're a little more complicated. Let's jump in. Now, before we can get into the actual goal of the game, which is checkmate, we first need to take a look at check, which is a little bit different. Check means that a king is under attack. So, if we want to check the black king here, we need to use our rook to attack the king. And that means that we are threatening to capture the king on our next turn. We won't actually be able to capture the king, but we can attack it and check it. So if we move the rook down to a8 or to e3, both of those moves would check the black king. So we can go here, and now the black king is in check. A check is the most forcing move in the game of chess, and that just means that you have to respond to it. And there are 3 ways that you can do this. You can move out of the check, block the check, or capture the piece giving the check. So in this case, when we give a check on e3 with our rook, the king can simply step out of the way and is no longer in check. The king could not move down to e7 because the king would still be in check. You see right here? So the king has to move out of the way. Here we have 2 kings and a bishop, and if we want to check the black king, we can move our bishop to any of these 2 squares. Both of those would check the king. So we can move our bishop to c4 and check the black king. Now the king cannot move to d5 because it would still be in check, and the king can never move into check, so we can step out of the way. Another way you can respond to check is by blocking the check. So if we want to give a check with our queen, let's say we go to c4, check. Black can step out of the way like before, or he can move the rook down to d5 and block the check. See, the rook intercepts the queen and the king, so now the king is no longer in check. If the queen had given this check on e3, the rook has no way to block the check by going to e3 because the rook doesn't move like that. So in this case, the king would have to move out of the way. Something I would like to point out is that if the king is being checked by a knight, so if we move our knight here to e6, we're checking the king, then there is no way to block that check because knights don't move like other pieces. They jump, they hop. So there's no way to block the path of the knight. So if you're being checked with a knight, you either have to move out of the way or capture the knight. So if the knight gives a check here on e6, this is what we call a fork, because the king and the knight, or the king and the queen are both under attack. And since the queen can't block the check anyway, the king has to move out of the way, and then the knight can capture the queen. And there's no way that black can avoid this after this check is given, because the king has to move, and then the knight can capture the queen. The third way that you can respond to a check is by capturing the piece that's delivering the check, because then it wouldn't be checking you anymore because it's off the board. So if this rook gave a check on e3, like this, check, the king could step out of the way, the knight could block on e5, or the third option, if we have it, is to capture the piece. See, the rook is capturable by the knight, so we can just take the rook, and now we're no longer in check because the piece giving the check no longer on the board. When it comes to capturing a piece that's delivering a check, kings can also do this. So if we gave a check with our pawn here by going f5, then the king, again, could move out of the way, but since this pawn is not defended by anything, meaning if the king were on e4, the pawn is defended, meaning the king cannot take it because it would be moving into check. So if it's undefended, like we have here, the king can just take the pawn, and we have a draw. Now let's talk about checkmate, which is the actual goal of the game. If you checkmate your opponent, you win. If you get checkmated, you lose. So a checkmate means the king is in check and has no legal moves to get out of it. So you cannot move out of the way, you cannot block the check, and you cannot capture the piece delivering the check. So here we have 2 kings and a queen. Now the queen can go all the way here to e7 and deliver checkmate. You see the queen covers all of these escape squares here. The king also plays a part. The king is defending the queen. So this black king cannot capture the queen because it would be moving into check. It would be right next to the opponent king, which is not allowed. So since this king has no legal moves, this would be checkmate and game over. Another checkmate in this position, aside from going to e7, would be going queen to b8. So this is also checkmate because the king cannot go here or here because it would still be in check by the queen. And it cannot go down to any of these squares because this king is doing a good job of creating a little wall, pushing that king against the edge of the board. So this would also be checkmate. Let me ask you this. This is a very similar position to the one I just showed you, except we have a rook instead of a queen. Can you find checkmate in 1? Meaning, on this move, we deliver checkmate and win the game. Can you find it? Good job! It's rook to a8, just like the queen. We deliver a check, the rook cuts off the king on this rank here, and our king is doing a good job of creating that little wall. If you didn't get it, no worries. The more you see of these, the more you'll start recognizing the patterns. But rook to a8 is checkmate. In this position, we have 2 kings. They each have 3 pawns, and white has a rook. And white can actually deliver checkmate in 1 here. Can you find it? Yeah, rook to c8. Similar to before, except instead of our king being, say, on this square, blocking the king's escape squares, the black king's own pawns are trapping it in. This is what we call a back rank checkmate. The rook comes down, and it's on the back rank, and the king is trapped behind all of his pawns, and this would be checkmate. Notice that all 3 of these pawns are on their starting squares, and that's kind of a signifier that a back rank checkmate might be an issue. The white king here, black doesn't have a rook to deliver mate with, but if he did, then we might not have to worry as much because we have pushed our h-pawn to h3, meaning that if a black rook came down to, say, d1 to give us a check, we have an escape square by going to h2. There's no back rank checkmate because we have this little escape square. Black does not have any such square, so black would be checkmated here. There's also something in chess called a stalemate, and that means the game ends in a draw. There is no winner. Each player gets half a point. So that occurs when, say, the black king here has no legal moves. The black player cannot make any moves, but the king is not in check. That's the key difference. If the king is in check and has no moves, it's checkmate, and we win. But here, you can see, if we make a move here, then the black king cannot go to any of these squares because the queen is cutting it off, and black has no legal moves. So this is what we call a stalemate, because we're not checking the king, but there's nothing he can do, so the game ends in a draw. There are plenty of different ways that the king can be stalemated, and here is one of them. Here, white has the ability to checkmate the king in a few moves, because with king and queen, you can checkmate the king. We'll save that for a different video on the technique for that. But here, let's say white didn't have much time or they didn't think too much on their turn, and they play queen to c6. This is stalemate. And even though we are up a queen, a full queen, it's still a draw. And that's because the queen cuts off all of these escape squares for the king, and our king cuts off the e7 square, so this king cannot have access to any of those squares, so this is a stalemate. Here in this position, we have a king and pawn endgame. White has 1 pawn and black just has a king, and this is a famously drawn position, and that is because white has no way to actually make a queen, because white either has to give up the pawn or stalemate the black king. Let's see what I mean here. If we push the pawn to d7, trying to advance to d8, the black king just steps over here, blocks the pawn, and we have no way to actually make any progress here. If the king goes to d6, this is stalemate, because the pawn cuts off these squares, and our king cuts off these squares. So the king is trapped in, stalemate. And there's no way to go around that, because if we try to go to, say, b7, king just takes here, and we have two kings. And obviously there's no way for them to checkmate each other, so this would be a draw. Another way that a chess game could be drawn, aside from stalemate, is by a position repeating itself 3 times. This would be a draw by repetition. Let's see what I mean here. In this position, white would love a draw, and that's because white is down a full rook and a bishop, and black is about to checkmate us on g2. Very bad, very bad. But luckily, white has a draw, and that is by going queen to e8, check, and the black king has no way to escape perpetual check. We're just going to keep checking the king until the position repeats itself 3 times. So this position we see has happened once. Black goes here, check. Black cannot escape to h6 because our pawn covers that square, so black has to go back. We give a check. This is the second time we've seen this. Here, here, and 3 times. This would be a draw. Another way that we can draw a chess game is by having insufficient mating material on the board. And that can occur if we have only a king and a bishop, or a king and a knight, because neither of those pieces alone can deliver checkmate against the king. And if we have a position like this would just be a draw. The game would end because there is just nothing that white is going to be able to do to mate the king, because black is just going to keep shuffling around and you're just going to be doing this forever. So the game ends in a draw here. The game also ends in a draw here because we only have a knight, and the knight is not going to be able to mate the king. You're just going to shuffle, shuffle, and nothing is going to get done. Another draw in chess is by the 50 move rule. That means that 50 moves have occurred without a pawn being pushed forward and without any captures. So here, if we just make 50 random moves with our pieces and say we're not actually going to try and capture the pawn, but we just kind of move pieces, even if the same position doesn't occur 3 times, if 50 moves occur, the game ends in a draw. Now let's start taking a look at some special moves in the game that I didn't discuss in the first video. One of which is castling, which is very important and you need to learn it. It's going to be a very important thing to do. And that looks like this. The king and the rook switch places. The king moves 2 squares over and the rook then goes adjacent to the king. So the king and the rook are on their starting squares. Castle. You can castle short or you can castle long. Here we are castling short. If white wanted to castle long, that would also be an option. So let's say we castle short, white castles long. And you can tell the difference because this would be short castle for white because it's less distance, and this is long castle. In order to castle, you need to have all of the squares in between the king and the rook available. So like this, white cannot castle short because where would these pieces go, right? So black can castle short, white can castle long. And notice that the white king does not go all the way here to kind of mirror the black king. It just moves 2 squares over. And the rook goes adjacent like that. Now, I said castling is very important, and it is. And that's because the king is generally safer on the side of the board after you castle than it is in the middle on its starting square. A huge battle is about to occur in the center of the board here, and the kings are going to be a little bit safer on the side of the board than trapped in the middle of all this. Like you see the queen and the rook here just barreling down this file if it ever opens. If the king were on one of these squares, it would be very dangerous to keep it there. So we like to castle to kind of get it surrounded by all of these pieces for defense. Another reason that you would want to castle, 1, get your king to safety, and 2, you get your other rook more involved in the game easily. So this rook here is not doing much, right? It's kind of trapped behind these pawns, staring at his king. This rook is doing a lot. It's on this open file. So the king would love to castle this way so that the rook can also become involved in the game. But unfortunately, black cannot castle in this position. And why is that? That's because the king cannot castle through check. Just like how a king can never step into check, the king cannot castle through it. And you see here, I'm not allowed to make, well, I guess it's white move, but black is not allowed to castle because this bishop is staring down the f8 square. So even though black wouldn't be landing on that square, he'd be landing on g8, he'd be going through check, and that's not allowed. So first, black would have to find a way to block the bishop's sight here or get rid of the bishop, and then be able to castle. Another reason you would not be able to castle is if the king has moved already. See, the king, it has to be the king's first move, along with the rook. So if we just get a random position here, see the queen gives a check to the king, and the king moves, the king has lost his castling rights. So now at no point during the game can black castle. The king is kind of stranded here. So it looks like we might be able to castle, right? Based off of how the king and the rook are set up. But unfortunately, we can't because we've already moved our king. And that's that. If the rook has moved already that the king is castling to, then we also can't castle. So even if, let's say the knight moves, let's say we make some moves. If this rook moves and then moves back, we can't castle because this rook has moved. So we cannot castle long. If the rook had not moved, then we would be able to castle. Another example of this, see here, if white moves his king to e2 and back, king's on his starting square, but since he's already moved, he can't castle. So black has castled, white would love to, but unfortunately, since white moved the king already, castling is not an option. There is another special move in chess called en passant, and that in French means in passing, and you'll see what I mean here. Let's say we make some moves, and this is a position where white can play en passant. So let's look here. White has a pawn on d5, and black is pushing this pawn 2 squares and lands right next to that pawn. If that happens, playing a pawn here right next to one of our pawns, we can capture by going this way, like that. It looks a little strange because you're not like landing on the pawn, but it's because black kind of skipped our pawn because we're controlling the c6 square. So if black made one pawn move, we would have had the option to capture it. Black tries to kind of get out of that by pushing it 2 squares. Nah, we still have the option to capture it as if it only moved 1 square. So we can capture just like that, and that is en passant. In order for en passant to be an option, then the pawn has to move 2 squares, and they have to land side by side. So here, if we moved 1 square, they're side by side, but you can't capture because it didn't go 2 squares. If black pushed the pawn 2 squares, the pawns are not side by side, so capturing is not an option. It has to be like the position I showed you before, where it's 2 squares forward, they land side by side, then you can capture 1 square diagonal. Okay, I'm sure that might have been a lot to take in all at once, but of course, feel free to go back, rewatch certain parts of the videos if you need to, but really, the best way to get all the basics ingrained is just by playing games. You can do this for free on chess.com or Lichess, that's L-I chess, and you can play against other people in real life with certain time parameters, like 10 minutes for each player. That's a great time to start out with, so you have a decent amount of time to think. If you liked this video, be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.